So I'm really honored to be here partnering with NASW to share some information with you today on self-advocacy. I hope that you find this information helpful. And of course, I'm happy to answer any questions following this webinar. And as well as if you want to connect more with me after today, I would be happy to collaborate with you in any way. So my contact information is in the handouts provided to you and also at the end of this presentation. So I have a lot of information to get through today, and we're just going to jump in. So this will generally look like what the outline is. Why is this topic so important? What self-advocacy really means, gaining client buy-in, and how to build skills for self-advocacy. Self-advocacy has always been a huge part of my life because I have been using a wheelchair my entire life. And I remember, as early as elementary school, growing up through the K-12 system, I realized that I had to learn how to ask for help, how to explain my needs to other people who didn't always understand, and I had to learn how to be a strong self-advocate in order to achieve my goals. So that was something that really became second nature to me growing up through school. I realized that there were things like disability oppression or ableism, and a lot of people have low expectations for people with disabilities. And I realized that in order to overcome some of those institutional, systemic, or cultural barriers, I just had to learn how to speak up and learn how to ask for help. And now, as a clinical social worker, I specialize in counseling people and families affected by disabilities so that they can also achieve their goals. But one of the things that I often notice when working with people and families affected by disabilities is that a real barrier for them is often an inability or a lack of experience with self-advocacy. So a lot of times I may be working with a client who has a disability, and for many reasons, they may just have not really grown up learning how to speak up. And that can be really intimidating for people that don't have any experience speaking up or don't have any experience advocating for themselves, or maybe for people that are more introverted, people that don't really have an outgoing, outspoken, bold personality. It can be really hard to learn how to self-advocate and learn how to speak up for yourself. So I notice that in the field a lot, and not to say that that's any fault of their own, it's just the reality is that they may not have much experience with it. So I really enjoy and appreciate helping these individuals empower themselves and helping to make sure that they have the skills that they need to advocate for their life throughout the rest of their life. Now, whenever we talk about advocacy in the social work profession, a lot of us fall back on our training that teaches us how to advocate on behalf of other people. And that's great. It's great that we have that training. It's great that we can speak up and reach out to community leaders and advocate for vulnerable populations. But when we think about the demographic group of individuals with disabilities, if we offer our clients with disabilities singular events of advocacy without teaching them the skills for self-advocacy, I believe that we're doing them a disservice to these clients in the long run, particularly if these clients have little experience with self-advocacy. The same may also be true for other demographic groups. So I want you to think about these things not just for clients with disabilities, but how can this be transferable or applicable to other demographic groups as well? If we're always advocating on behalf of them, are we really teaching them to advocate for themselves throughout the rest of their lives? So that's an interesting concept, because I know, like myself included, we're always really quick to advocate for people. And many of you have probably experienced times in your work when you have advocated on behalf of someone or have stepped in to do something for a client rather than teaching the client how to do it for themselves. And that's okay. We've all been in those situations. But particularly for clients with disabilities, I really want to drive home this point for this population, because clients with disabilities are going to have to advocate for themselves throughout their entire lifespan. And I believe it's really critical for this population, perhaps more than others, to learn how to express their needs, speak up, and advocate for themselves. It's really important for this population because individuals and families affected by disabilities have so many societal barriers to overcome. They're constantly having to problem solve. They're constantly having to speak up about what their needs are to people that probably don't understand disability very well. They're constantly having to secure accommodations, whether in school or in the workplace or in the healthcare arenas. They're constantly having to innovate, adapt, and advocate for their needs throughout the lifespan and their lifetime. It's just part of life having to do all of those things and having to navigate a world that wasn't designed for disability. And what I mean by that is that, we live in this able bodied world where most things historically were not designed for a person using a wheelchair, a person who is deaf, a person who has a visual impairment. Things weren't designed that way inherently. We've made accommodations over the decades, especially since the ADA was passed in 1990, but still, there are so many things about, just our cultural beliefs, the world that we live in, the ideologies that people hold regarding disability, the way that people make assumptions about disability, the way that people pity disability or don't really know how to empathize or include people with disabilities. There are all these things that still exist for people with disabilities, and they're going to experience that throughout their entire lifespan. So that's one of the reasons that it's really important for self advocacy to be one of the strong skills that they hold. But unfortunately, a very common experience for many people with disabilities is that they often feel subject to other people speaking for them. And what do I mean by these other people? Well, this might be teachers as they grow up through school, healthcare professionals, leaders of organizations that allocate resources, insurance providers, employers, sometimes even our own neighbors and friends. Sometimes people may have really good intentions, but if they don't fully understand the complexity of disability, ideas surrounding ability privilege, maybe they don't understand the importance of giving individuals with disabilities resources or giving them a voice, particularly for children with disabilities. What happens is that people with disabilities typically end up feeling misunderstood, feeling isolated, or not being able to access the things that they need in order to be socially included or to be able to access equal opportunities, education, and overall achieve their goals. Now, keep in mind that this isn't the case for everyone. Just like other commonalities or themes for different identity groups, we can't make assumptions, and these things that I mentioned about feeling misunderstood, feeling isolated, not being able to access things, that's not always going to be the case for every person with a disability. So take some of this with a grain of salt. But I mentioned this just to increase your awareness that for people with disabilities, they often are subject to other people speaking for them. And that's a problem. So the idea behind this is that social workers who are competent in teaching skills for strong self-advocacy can set clients with disabilities up for a lifetime of success, accessing what they need to be fully integrated in the community, achieve their goals, enhance their mental health and wellness, and become more autonomous, independent people with as much access to equal opportunities as possible. So as we move through the slides, learning about what self-advocacy really means, I want to encourage you to think about how you can tailor treatment plans for clients with disabilities so that there is at least some focus on strengthening skills for self-advocacy, regardless of the type of disability or other demographic information. Because just as you can see on this slide, self-advocacy really does lead to so many benefits for this community: achievement, positive self-concept, inclusion, success, resiliency, community integration. There are so many benefits when people with disabilities feel like they have a voice and feel confident and capable of speaking up. So now I'm going to get into a little bit more depth on what does self-advocacy mean. So I like to think of self-advocacy in terms of learning how to speak up for yourself, learning how to be assertive when explaining what your needs are in order to obtain an accommodation or a resource, being able to make your own decisions about your own life, learning how to utilize information and resources to your advantage, knowing what your rights and responsibilities are, strategically using the support of other people to accomplish your goals, and not giving up or backing down when faced with barriers. So the definition of self-advocacy is going to vary, especially if you look at the literature, or if you just ask a person with a disability what self-advocacy means to them. You're going to get all of these different ideas, and there's probably not going to be a clear-cut definition. But in my practice, I like to think of self-advocacy as all of these different things. Essentially, it's about speaking up for yourself and being in control of your own life. So essentially, I break it down to these three things. A strong self advocate is someone who is able to understand their needs and is able to communicate about their needs in order to accomplish their goals. The goal of self advocacy is for your client to decide what exactly they want and then develop and carry out a plan to get it. Now, does being a strong self advocate mean that you can't ask for help or have someone help you along your journey? Not at all. A lot of people are under the impression that being a strong self advocate means that you have to do everything independently and you have to know exactly what the answers are. And that is simply not the case. In fact, sometimes the best thing that you can do for yourself as a strong self advocate is to recognize what you want, but also recognize that you're ill equipped in some way to accomplish what you want. And so you realize that you do need someone with some expertise or special skills to partner with you to guide you through a challenging process. But the key to strong self advocacy, even when you're using an expert by your side, is that you're still communicating exactly what your needs are. The client is still in the driver's seat. The client is still dictating what their needs are and making appropriate decisions for themselves. So rather than relying on the expert to make decisions for them, a strong self advocate may utilize information from the expert, but is ultimately blazing their own trail moving forward. So, how do we teach this to clients? Remind clients with disabilities that they're not alone. They don't need to feel like they are alone or like they have to have all the answers, but they do need to be in the driver's seat even when using outside resources like professional experts. The reality is that a lot of people with disabilities feel isolated and alone, like I mentioned earlier, because they're living in this able bodied world where they may not even know that many other people with disabilities like themselves. And so you don't want in any way, shape, or form to make a client with a disability feel like they are alone. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to step in and do everything for them, but you do want to emphasize that there are resources available, there are experts available. You are certainly one of those experts in their life, but you may also want to connect them with some additional experts. No matter what, though, you want to continue to reinforce that they need to be in the driver's seat. Even when they're using these resources, it's their job to take that information, analyze it, reflect on it, consider it, but then ultimately make their own decisions. Self-advocacy may also mean that we have to disclose personal things about our lives that maybe we don't always want to disclose to other people. If you live with a disability, learning difference, or condition of any type, whether you're hard of hearing, blind, or any other disability, including people with chronic illnesses, a lot of these things are not easily understood or well known by able bodied people or non disabled people. And it might feel really scary to have to speak up and communicate what your personal needs are. A lot of people struggle with this. I see this all the time. When people need to have an accommodation, whether in the classroom or in college or in their work environment, they really struggle to ask for that accommodation because they don't want to feel different and they don't want to feel like they are in some way burdening someone. They don't want to be burdened, such as a teacher or an employer, by asking for that accommodation. These feelings are very real and they're very valid, and I know that it can be really hard to self disclose. We see this a lot when I work with individuals that are transitioning from high school to college. In high school, students with disabilities have a lot of accommodations already set up for them through an IEP or 504 plan. But when they get to college, none of those accommodations are in place unless they self disclose. So that takes the student, not the parent, but the student has to go to the disability office and self-disclose. And a lot of students with disabilities in college just don't do that because they're afraid or they don't want to self-disclose. And I understand, these feelings are very real and they're valid. And I know that it can feel really hard to have to speak up and communicate personal things about your disability to other people who maybe you don't feel safe talking to. And then what happens when they do find themselves in a situation like this is when they do finally bring it up, they tend to apologize for their needs. They tend to feel like, I'm really sorry. It's just that I'm thinking about having this accommodation. They tend to be really apologetic, and that can undermine their feelings of empowerment. And the bottom line that I always, always, always try to reinforce with my clients with disabilities is that you should not have to apologize for needing an accommodation or a resource. You didn't ask for your disability. You didn't want to have a disability. It's just a part of your life. And if you live your life continuing to be apologetic, continuing to feel like a burden or to feel like you're struggling with disability shame, I can certainly talk about disability shame on a whole nother webinar, so I won't get into this too much. But I try to reinforce, if you continue to live with feeling like you're a burden, feeling like you have to apologize, that's going to undermine your empowerment and lead to negative mental health. So you should never have to apologize for needing a service or an accommodation that can help you access equal opportunities and inclusion. So how can we teach this with clients? Work with your clients with disabilities on their assertiveness skills. Work with them on their confidence. Maybe use role play. Explore their feelings of shame. And work on identifying with them where that shame comes from so they can better understand why they may be experiencing feelings of shame. And they can work with you on reframing some of their self talk. This can really go a long way in helping clients feel more comfortable or more open, disclosing some of their disability related needs to the people that they need to be speaking with when they're advocating for themselves. Another quick point here is that a lot of my clients with disabilities end up being apologetic or feeling like a burden, but also minimizing their disability. So downplaying it, pretending like their disability doesn't matter, pretending like it doesn't exist for the sake of inclusion or for the sake of normalcy. But what happens is when they're minimizing their disability, whether unconsciously or consciously, they're actually making things harder for themselves because they're neglecting some accommodations or some adaptation in their life that they could utilize that would make things easier for them. So be on the lookout for that. Are they minimizing their disability, whether unconsciously or consciously? Are they downplaying it? Are they doing that because of shame or fear? And how can they really confront that and challenge that so that they can live their lives to the fullest extent possible and feel confident in speaking up and asking for what they need? One last thing that I want to mention here on what self advocacy really means before we get into some additional content is that sometimes we will be faced with opposition. I know this firsthand. So I, have always considered myself someone that really is outgoing and speaks up. I studied abroad 4 times in college. I lived on my own. I require all types of different caregiving assistance and medical needs, but I'm always speaking up and I'm always trying to overcome barriers. Now, was that easy? Absolutely not. None of that was easy. None of my leadership roles in the community have been easy. None of my accommodations in the workplace have been easy. And I have been faced with tremendous opposition. And sometimes being a self advocate means that you are going to have to manage that opposition. You are going to have to cope with that distress. You're going to have to experience difficult conversations with people of authority. And I know that can be really hard to face. A lot of people, whether you have a disability or not, so this really applies to the general population, a lot of people really struggle with having difficult conversations, with people of authority especially, because of the power difference. So anytime that we are talking to someone with more authority than ourselves, we know that it can feel really intimidating and very challenging to stand up to that person and to speak assertively about what our needs are. So this is when you're really going to work on those coping skills. You're going to ask yourself, how can I take care of myself in this moment? How can I stop, pause, take a break, step back, take care of myself, but then also explore my next steps? Rarely the answer is to give up. That is usually not the answer. And so when I'm working with clients that are feeling really discouraged, really defeated about something that they want to accomplish and they're just not getting good results, I take that opportunity to pause and reflect and really process that frustration and really sit with that. And then really think about how we can take care of ourselves. How can we cope with this in a really healthy, productive way? And then when we're ready, how can we re enter the process? How can we explore the next steps? What are we going to do next? So, teaching this to clients, what I want you to think about is if your clients face this type of opposition, how can they take care of themselves in this moment? How can they deal with this? How can they cope with these negative feelings? How can they remain confident about what they need to accomplish without allowing this other person or this opposition to make them feel powerless or helpless? So, again, just reinforcing that. How can they take care of themselves? Rely on what works for them. Really listen to them. Put your client in the driver's seat and ask them how they can take care of themselves, how they have faced with opposition in the past, and what's getting in the way, what's stopping them from continuing forward. If they feel like giving up, really use that motivational interviewing. Talk to them. Think about what's getting in the way. We had a setback, but what's getting in the way of continuing to move forward? Because there's always other alternatives and options that you can explore. Getting buy-in from clients. So, self-advocacy is really important because it means, sorry about that, go back. Self-advocacy is really important because you are your own best advocate. It allows you to be the expert on your own life. You get to take control. It leads to better mental health, and it's a continual learning process. So the truth is, your clients with disabilities are their own best advocates. In both my counseling practice and my disability advocacy organization, I really encourage people to be their own advocates because nobody knows your life and your needs better than you do. So I often say, yes, we have all these advocates in the community, but you know your life and what your needs are better than anybody else, better than any advocates in the community, better than teachers, doctors, social workers, counselors, lawyers, or any other advocates of any kind. The number one thing that I always say, in addition to that, in the beginning of working with someone with a disability, is that I don't have all the answers. I may be an individual with a disability. I've been using a wheelchair my whole life. I'm a disability advocate and a social worker. But I don't claim to be an expert on your life. I don't claim to be an expert on disability, especially as it relates to your life. Even if a person who has muscular dystrophy like I do, or who has been using a wheelchair like I have, who needs caregiving, who has muscular weaknesses, who comes from the same background as I do with lots of support, even if that picture looks the same, I still always make a point to emphasize that I don't have all the answers and they are their own best advocates. Self advocacy is so important because it gives people that platform to have their voice heard and it leads to that empowerment. So be humble with your clients. Let them know that you don't claim to be an expert and that they know their life best. Self-advocacy also eliminates the possibility of other people speaking for you who may not understand what your needs are. So again, I just think self-advocacy is so important because it allows other people to listen to the individual with a disability. It allows the individual with a disability to live up to their own expectations rather than the expectations from other people. And it allows people with disabilities to be more included in the world. And if you haven't already figured this out, self-advocacy can lead to more positive mental health outcomes for all of these reasons. So in the mental health field, we know that people have better psychological health when they feel in control of their lives, when they have self-awareness and can utilize their strengths, when they can express their wants and needs, when they can develop a vision for what they want and achieve it, and when they feel like they're living their best lives. And just the opposite, when you feel like you don't have control, when you feel like you're being treated unfairly, like you're being denied something, or when you simply just feel like your voice isn't being heard, that often leads to anxiety and depression. And so this is very true for clients with disabilities. It's really important to know that self-advocacy leads to positive mental health and to know that it is that continual learning process. Every single person, regardless of the amount of experience that they may have with advocacy, can always learn more. So I consider myself to be a pretty strong self-advocate because I've been really outspoken throughout my life. But at the same time, I'm always learning new things about self advocacy. So it doesn't matter how much experience you have. Self advocacy is a wide spectrum of skills and abilities. Some people may have been doing it their whole life, and for other people, it may be a totally new concept. But the important thing to know is that you can always strengthen your skills. You can always learn more about yourself and the barriers that you face, and you can always lead by example for other people who are working on their self advocacy skills. So we are just going to take a quick couple-minute break to address any questions that you may have. And then the last part of the presentation is 10 tips that I have for how to continue teaching and how to continue emphasizing these points with your clients.
Great, thanks, Lauren. This has been fantastic so far. These webinars are always so tough because I feel like in an hour we really could do this for a couple of days on end. But one of the questions that came, you kind of answered, but maybe some clarification. In specifically what ways social workers can empower their clients to ask for help if that's not been the norm in their life. You've talked about assertiveness skills, role playing, those sort of things. Are there any sort of assertiveness skills exercises that you have come across that seem to be extra effective with clients?
Sure. I utilize role play a lot. And I also really challenge them to think about what the worst thing that could happen could be. So a lot of my clients are really afraid to speak up because they really worry about the outcome. And I work with them on thinking about, okay, so what would happen if you spoke up and the person said no? That would not be the worst case scenario. The worst case scenario might be never speaking up and always wondering what could have happened. So, kind of just reframing those fears, acknowledging those fears, wondering where those fears come from. So, if somebody says, I'm really scared to speak up because I'm worried about, being viewed as a burden or being viewed as kind of inconveniencing someone. So, that may be a launching point to explore their history. Are there people in their life that made them feel that way in the past? Let's dig a little deeper. Let's not just assume that at face value. Let's really explore that a little deeper. Where does that internalized ableism come from? And again, I could do a whole nother presentation or some collaborative training on internalized ableism, which essentially what that is when people with disabilities sort of internalize the ableism or the ability discrimination that they may have witnessed or experienced. So if they have, been in an internship and they needed some accommodations and nobody really took them seriously, nobody valued them, it was really difficult for them to secure those accommodations and they ended up just feeling like a burden. And then maybe a couple years later, they go to apply for a job and now they're really, really scared to speak up. It's probably because of that prior experience where they did internalize that discrimination and they started to think of themselves as a burden and they started to think of themselves as not worthy of that. So I really try to dig a little deeper and think about, where does that come from? Kind of using a psychodynamic approach of thinking, have you had experiences like this in the past? Ask them if they know what ableism is. How do they conceptualize that? How do they conceptualize ability privilege? How do they think about themselves? What stereotypes do they resonate with or that make them angry or stereotypes that they feel like they're subjected to? For a lot of different minority groups, it's really not until high school, college, or even young adulthood that they really start to examine their identity as someone with a minority identity. I know for myself, I never really identified as having a disability until maybe I was in college and I started learning about things like ableism and about the way that I've been treated or the oppression that exists. But growing up, yeah, I used a wheelchair since I was 5 years old, but I never really thought of myself as any different. I never really knew that there were terms like ability privilege. So sometimes it's just bringing that psychoeducation into the counseling session, talking about, have you ever considered that you may be afraid to speak up because of some of your past experiences where you felt different because of your disability? So I know that was kind of a lot of just quick info, and I would be happy to discuss this more with you on certain cases, at a later time. But I hope that gets you thinking a little bit at least.
No, that was wonderful. And then two other questions. Do you ask your clients to use journaling between therapy sessions to help them express needs?
I do, yes. I really enjoy utilizing journaling with clients. Again, it has to be from the client though, so I'll suggest it. But if they're not interested in that, or if they hate journaling, I don't like to force it. But certainly, I've worked with clients that have used journaling, that really enjoy journaling, that really get something out of it. So if I do recommend it to a client, I make sure that they're going to actually feel invested in it, because sometimes I don't like to assign interventions between sessions that is going to add to their frustration, or that's going to elicit some negative feelings for them on their own without having the safe space and counseling to process it. So I think that really just depends on the client.
Great, thank you. And then question from Tim. Do you have any words of wisdom for social workers working with little kiddos that have disabilities? I see some in my private practice, and they always seem so very positive, but at times they can get down. Just wondering from an adult perspective, what could you say to a little child?
Absolutely. So kids need to have role models. They need to have play therapy that incorporates disability. They need to have, if it's a little girl that loves to play with dolls, make sure that she has a doll with a disability as well. Make sure that they have role models, older people, whether they're teens with disabilities or young adults, that can mentor them or just check in with them. They need to be able to see themselves represented in things. So whether it's, like the doll example or other types of play activities, try children's books that have people with disabilities in the children's book. They want to see themselves represented because they want to see that that's normal to have a difference. It's really isolating when kids are the only person in their entire school that has a disability. They may not struggle with that right away, but as they grow up, they may start to struggle with that a little bit more. So I always emphasize, social support. Check out summer camps that they can go to. There are so many summer camps for kids with disabilities, and even if it's only 1 week out of the year, that would foster, that environment where they could just be around other people with disabilities. Children's adaptive sports, recreation, those are great outlets to be around other people with disabilities as well. And really look at what's happening within the family. Is the family talking about disability, or are they pretending like it doesn't exist? Because if they pretend like it doesn't exist, because that can happen, a lot of parents are really hesitant to talk about disability with their kids because they fear that talking about it is going to make the child feel bad. Or, a lot of parents are really grieving the loss of normalcy for their child. And so they're having a hard time talking about disability with their child. So they just don't, they do if they have to, like at a medical appointment, but otherwise they don't talk about disability with their child because they're afraid of how the child might react. But I would say, as a practitioner in this field, that's doing a disservice, because your child is going to internalize that it's something to be ashamed of, that we can't talk about it. God forbid we have a conversation about it. They're going to feel like, for whatever reason, it's not okay to talk about. And that's not what you want to promote. You want to promote that it's okay to talk about it. You want the parents to be involved in talking about it. Maybe not all the time, but if there's an opportunity to go to an adaptive sports event or a summer camp or a fundraiser, whatever the case might be, you want it to play a role in the family, especially for the siblings of a child with a disability, because those siblings are also experiencing the different experience of having a sibling with a disability. And they want to know that it's okay to talk about it as well. And that if they have questions about the child with a disability, they want to know that they can talk about it. So those are just some ideas. And again, there's so much more to talk about this subject. So again, I'm happy to be contacted later.
Wonderful, Lauren. Just one more question, and I think we'll move on for time. How do you advocate for clients with cognitive disabilities, and does that look different from some of the suggestions you've already given?
It does look a little different, but it's not that different. Really, when you're working with someone with a cognitive disability, a lot of these themes will be the same. It's just that you might have to tailor the treatment a little bit. So people with cognitive disabilities, they want the same things as people without cognitive disabilities. They want to feel included. They want to feel like they have a voice. They want to feel like they fit in. They want to feel like they have social support. People with cognitive disabilities are really not that different from people, let's say, with only a physical impairment. Really, the only difference in treatment might be, we may have to bring in some additional support. We may have to use the parents or other family members to reinforce these ideas a little bit more, or we may have to break down the concepts more. Sometimes with cognitive impairments, you're not really going to be using a psychodynamic approach, but instead you're going to be using a solution focused approach. So instead of really doing that insightful work on where do these feelings come from, which may be difficult for someone with a cognitive impairment, you want to focus more on, okay, so this is the problem that we're experiencing. Let's say you want to have more social opportunities. Okay, well, how can we speak up? How can we advocate for you to have more social opportunities? What in the community can we access so that you can have more social opportunities? Or so you can have whatever it is that you're trying to accomplish. So again, it might look a little different. You might use, that solution focused approach. You might do more role play. You might break things down more. Sometimes with cognitive impairments, I spend more time on coming up with a script. If you feel like you're not getting your voice heard, what are some positive phrases that you can practice? And I'll actually get out a notebook and I'll come up with some positive phrases with the client so that they have that sheet of paper or they have those skills that they're actually taking away with them. So those sessions tend to look a little bit more skill based. But again, you're really using the same foundation of, how can we increase this person's voice? How can we make sure that they have a voice? And I would say for cognitive impairments, it's even more important to make sure that they have a voice because those individuals are more subjected to people speaking for them. And I know that in some cases, for medical decisions or, for whatever the case might be, that may be necessary. The parents or the guardians involved may have to step in and speak for them. So it's a balance, it's a balance of understanding when they do need some assistance with decision making. But I would still strongly encourage to maximize whatever decisions that they can make. So if they need assistance in certain areas like financial stuff or housing or medical decisions, that's one thing. But give them as much opportunity to have decisions as much as and as often as they can. So again, just maximizing their voice, making sure that they're deciding what they do every day, how they spend their life, what they're involved in, what they like, really tailoring that treatment so that they're speaking up as much as they can.
Wonderful, thank you. Let's go ahead and we'll save any other questions for the end.
Okay, sounds good. And for the sake of time, I am just going to sort of breeze through these 10 ideas pretty quickly. But again, if you want to expand on any of these ideas with me, I would be happy to collaborate more later. So number one, develop a vision. Absolutely. You have to have a clear understanding of what your objective is. You want to really identify with the client, why is this imperative? And encourage the client to build rationale. So have an idea and really have a good understanding of why that idea or what it is that you're trying to accomplish is important to you. Strengthen self-awareness. So you are going to have a copy of these slides in the handout that is provided to you that you can download, and I believe Dwayne will send out. So you don't need to worry about memorizing these questions, but these are some questions for clients with disabilities that can help strengthen their self-awareness. So what are my values as a person with a disability? How do I relate or not relate to stereotypes? What exactly are my needs? How much or how little does my disability impact me? All of these questions can be really good conversation starters for strengthening some self-awareness. 3, acknowledge obstacles. So ignoring obstacles doesn't make them go away, just like ignoring our feelings doesn't make them go away. Really encourage honest conversations about barriers. I know that, especially for children, it's hard to talk about barriers and obstacles. I believe that it should be talked about anyway, because the more that we can acknowledge and accept the obstacles, the more that we can take control and find ways to get around them. So foster a willingness to accept and openly talk about obstacles, but in a very nonchalant way that doesn't put a person down, but just talks about, okay, so these are limitations, but these are our strengths, and these are the things that we're going to do to knock down some of those barriers. Every single person has strengths. Utilize those strengths. Ask yourself, how does my client best express information to other people in their life? Do they prefer phone calls, in person, Some people really prefer communicating about their needs in writing, like through emails to teachers, employers, or other people. So think about how they best express information and what strengths overall do they have in their personality that can be applied here. Basically, one of the core tenets of the social work profession. 5, teach follow through information seeking. So it's really easy for clients to talk about what they want to do in the session, but what are they doing outside of the session to follow through on those steps? What are the next steps? Maybe you make a list, write them down. What can my client realistically commit to? So don't create a plan that is overwhelming and just not something that a client can actually commit to. Really explore how you can focus on accountability. How can you reinforce these ideas that breaking down goals into smaller steps is going to be really important for achieving them. Teach that follow through information seeking. 6, mentioned this earlier, but strengthen assertiveness communication. What gets in the way of speaking up? Is it that internalized fear, or is it really just that adults are speaking for them and they're not giving them a chance? Or, what is actually getting in the way of speaking up? How can we give them more opportunities? And what are the communication patterns that you're noticing? So take some time to think about what happens when they speak up and how can they maximize their ability to speak up. What are those communication patterns that are impacting the communication flow? 7, embrace resiliency when faced with opposition. So is my client internalizing the opposition? Is there any self-blame? Self-blame is a big one for clients with disabilities. They want to ask for an accommodation or they want to speak up, but if they face that opposition, they might end up blaming themselves. So you want to curb that. You really want to curb that self-blame and say, no, this isn't anything to do with you personally. This is just a matter of, we faced an opposition, we faced a barrier, and we're going to have to recalculate how we're going to move forward and how can we refocus. Number 8, again, explore those ideas of ableism. What does disability as a minority status mean? Does my client understand that? Is my client aware of ableism? Is my client coping with this in healthy ways? So really teach them about this concept, talk to them about this. Do they experience this? Do they not? In what ways have they felt different or excluded or, like they're less than? Have they ever felt that way? Maybe, maybe not, but it's important to talk about and explore it. Number 9, strengthen self-esteem. So are there self-esteem concerns and where does that come from? Sometimes it may have nothing to do with a disability. They may struggle with self-esteem for many other characteristics or experiences that they have. Remember, disability is just one part of the picture. It's just one part of who they are. It's definitely not their whole self, and it's definitely not what they are completely defined by. So when we think about self-esteem, let's look at the whole picture. Provide psychoeducation on the link between self-esteem and self-advocacy. Number 10, connect, refer when needed. Absolutely. Just like I would not ever treat someone with substance abuse because I have no training in that and it's outside of my scope of practice, I encourage you not to continue working with someone if you really feel ill-equipped. We all have to refer when we are ill-equipped. It's impossible to know how to effectively work with every single case. So if you are feeling ill-equipped, refer when appropriate. Seek consultation. Sometimes you don't even need to refer, but you may want to seek some consultation or use community resources. So takeaways, no two people are exactly alike. No two disabilities are exactly alike, and no two life experiences with self-advocacy will be alike. Clients with disabilities will benefit from a social work relationship that supports the client as their own self-advocate. And lastly, I just want to say that if people with disabilities rely on others to advocate for them throughout their lives, they're never going to become truly empowered or develop a strong, fully fulfilled voice on their own. And so I believe it's really critical for individuals with disabilities to find their own voice in the world. And I know we just have a few minutes for questions, so we'll jump into that. And here are just a variety of ways that I am happy to help and I would love to connect with you on.
Thank you, Lauren. You powered through all of those specifics at the end, which are all really fantastic, and they all seemingly align pretty clearly with the code of ethics. couple of resources that were shared, and feel free to type any last questions folks have into the chat box. But a resource from Laura. I follow a great interabled couple on YouTube called Squirmy and Grubs. Just for folks, it's another thing to look at, and I'll just paste that into the chat box so folks have that title. I don't know if you have followed them before, Lauren. Squirmy and Grubs is that particular resource.
Yeah, there's actually a lot of great resources, and maybe at some point I'll compile a list of them. That's a really great one, so I'm glad that you mentioned it. There's also something called Laughing at My Nightmare or Laughing with My Nightmare. It's Shane Burkott. He's also recently married. He has a disability, and his wife is non-disabled, and they similarly do a great job portraying the interabled relationship.
Great, that's a really good one too. One resource that I wanted to share too is another way to empower clients or get them active in communities is there are many local disability rights coalitions or citywide groups or countywide groups that folks can get involved with that may be really good ways for your clients to be active in ways that they didn't know that they could be. So just as another resource for folks to know what's available in your particular area, because I know they do exist, I think, pretty much in most counties in the state. But the last question that kind of came through is, how have you seen practices or services change since the pandemic, and what are the unique challenges with being in a more virtual climate?
Sure. Yeah, no, I love what you said, Dwayne, about some of the local resources. There are many of those coalitions, like you mentioned, and there's also the Centers for Independent Living. I believe there's 15 in the state of Michigan, and those are tremendous community groups that, community agencies that really advocate on all disabilities of all types. So Centers for Independent Living are great to check out. Now, for the question, I would say one of the biggest challenges has been the individuals with disabilities that rely on community resources and community social programming for their feeling of belongingness in the community. I'm working with some clients right now that have had their social community programs cut and or postponed because of the pandemic, and they're really struggling with feeling lonely and feeling like that exhaustion and fatigue from virtual chat. Technology is great, but I think one of the challenges for individuals with disabilities is that they sometimes feel a greater sense of isolation, in this pandemic of not having the ability to connect with other people in the community, especially for individuals with cognitive impairments. There's a lot of social groups and social programming that, for some of them, that is really their whole sense of belonging and where they find purpose. And when those have been postponed because of the pandemic, it's been really challenging for them to maybe succeed on virtual technology or to feel like they're getting the same benefits virtually. So that has definitely been a challenge in some cases.
All right, looks like maybe we have time for one more last question. And thanks for folks. I know it's at 1, so if you need to pop off, totally understand. Just remember to please fill out the post test. That'll come in an hour from now. But one last question from Elaine. Do you have any suggestions for what social workers can do to work with aggressive or angry clients?
Yes. So I will fully admit that I probably would refer out even for myself because I've worked with that population a little bit, but I don't necessarily feel like I have a full competency in aggression. In the cases that I have had, it has usually been aggression along with some other symptoms that we have managed. For the aggression piece, it's a lot of skill building. It's a lot of coping skills. It's a lot of mindfulness. So I really utilize mindfulness with aggression with clients with disabilities who have aggression. And then I would also really take a look at their family system or their social system. And usually for clients with disabilities that have aggression along with a cognitive impairment, especially, it's really looking at how we can adapt their whole environment. So not just teaching them a few skills in a session, but looking at who else can we bring into the session. So social supports, caregivers, people that are involved in their life, because aggression is very pervasive and it can affect all areas of life. And if that's the case, I think you definitely want to have a team approach, a team oriented approach where you're working with the whole family. For example, there are some resources that I can email out on that subject area if you would like to contact me after, because it is a unique area. And I think I'm continuing my training on that. But again, I would definitely maybe refer out. There are some other clinicians that specialize more so in aggression um, to handle something like that.
Great advice, Lauren, and thank you for this session today. I know I learned a lot. This was very helpful with some tangible things folks can take back to their practice. If folks have additional questions after today, please feel free to email me, and I can pass those on to Lauren, or she did put her contact information in the handout. But if folks need anything else, feel free to reach out after today. But that is time, so we hope to see you maybe tonight at our social justice meeting, but if not, we'll have you on our next month's webinar. So enjoy the rest of your week, everyone, and thank you again, Lauren, for your expertise.
Thank you again for having me. It's been an amazing experience to do this, and I'm just really humbled and honored. And I would love to connect with more of you. But for now, that's all the time we have, like Dwayne said. And thank you again so much.